there's been this crazy buzz that Jesus has risen from the dead.
The Bible's greatest miracle.
There's a gap between his resurrection and his ascension.
Remains one of its greatest mysteries.
Well, what was he doing during those 40 days?
They don't tell you the very thing that you and I would ask.
Why is he back?
Now religion and science meet at the cross.
Much more happened in these 40 days than we're told through the Gospels.
He's telling you how he overcame death.
A new investigation into the lost 40 days that sparked the Christian faith.
Let's get down into it and see what really happened.
What it reveals could impact the faith of millions. In the effort to understand and visualize the fourth appearance of Jesus Christ, an encounter with a disciple known as Thomas, the path leads to the 20th century. The place, a remote corner of Egypt near the town of Nag Hammadi, not far from the Nile River.
A group of local farmhands were digging for fertilizer out in a wilderness area just outside of Nag Hammadi, Egypt. One of their shovels hit something hard.
They dug it up, they found something that it's quite enormous, this jar, 6 feet high.
These men were reluctant to open the jar because they thought there might be an evil genie inside. But then they thought about it further and they realized there might be gold in there.
In it was contained a whole stack of books out of an ancient library from a monastery. Gospels, secret revelations, writings, dialogues, all kinds of things that we never knew existed.
The Nag Hammadi library contains 52 different tractates. When they were discovered, they made a sensational splash because it contains some books that we knew about but didn't have. It included other books that we didn't know existed.
The discovery of the buried library of Nag Hammadi, 52 books about Jesus Christ not included in the New Testament, is considered by many to be the most spectacular find in modern Christian archaeology.
These are 13 leather-bound volumes written on papyrus, the ancient writing material. They're written in Coptic, the ancient Egyptian language. The books were manufactured sometime in the 4th Christian century. We know this because the leather bindings that were used to encapsulate the books have their spines strengthened with dated receipts. And so on the basis of the dates in these receipts, we know when the books were manufactured. There are solid reasons for thinking that these Coptic books are translations of Greek originals that were written sometime in the 2nd century or possibly even earlier.
In the attempt to visualize the 40 days between resurrection and ascension, Ray Dowding and his team face a serious challenge. A strange gospel said to have been written by the Apostle Thomas.
Thomas is curious in a particular way, and it relates to the name Thomas. Thomas means the twin. And there's a meaning inside this gospel that this gospel is a way of becoming the twin of Jesus. That he's in fact saying, understand this stuff, and you're me.
Some of the teachings of the Gospel of Thomas echo words spoken by Jesus in the New Testament, but other content is considered highly controversial by many Christians.
In the New Testament, Jesus preaches that the kingdom of God is coming soon, and that means the world is about to be destroyed and transformed, and you know, there's going to be the end of the world and the day of judgment, and you better be ready. When you read the Gospel of Thomas, there Jesus says the kingdom of God is not something coming at the end of time. It's something inside you, outside of you. It's something everywhere. It's living in the presence of God.
You have a spark of the divine within you. You have to know yourself to come into the kingdom. You are the sons of the living Father. If you don't know yourself, you aren't going to have salvation.
Some scholars believe the strange teachings found in the Gospel of Thomas and in the other texts from the buried library discovered in 1945, are only a small fraction of the lost writings about the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
There were a lot of Gospels that didn't make it into the New Testament, and many of these have been permanently lost, and so we don't know exactly what they were.
But were these Gospels really lost? Or were there other, more sinister motives for leaving them out of the New Testament? The answer begins with the writing of the first stories about a resurrected Jesus Christ. Many believe that the authors of the Gospels were apostles who had themselves witnessed the events of the 40 days.
They told what they experienced. That's firsthand knowledge. If we're going to put that into doubt, let's keep in mind we're putting into doubt firsthand experience.
Others challenge that claim.
These Gospels are written 30, 40, 50 years after the events that they describe by people who were not there to see these things happen. In other words, after Jesus died, people started telling stories about him, and as they converted other people to believe in him, the converts told the stories to other converts, who told stories to other converts to other converts, and over time, these stories are being spread far and wide among people who hadn't seen any of these things happen.
Over decades, great numbers of stories about the resurrected Jesus were written down.
It was only into the 3rd and 4th century that the church narrowed down the wealth of dozens and dozens and dozens of sacred texts to what was called a canon of texts. Canon is a Greek word for list. What books would be on the list?
The early church fathers had 4 different criteria that they used in order to decide which book should be in, which should be out. The first criterion is a book had to be ancient. It had to go back to the days of Jesus and his apostles. Secondly, the book had to be written by an apostle or by a companion of the apostles. They also had to be widely used. They couldn't be local favorites. They had to be used throughout the whole of Christendom, is the third criterion. And the fourth criterion is they couldn't promote some kind of heretical or false teaching. They had to toe the line theologically.
So these texts were assembled over time and then became the 27 books of the New Testament, that is, the sacred scriptures of the Christian movement.
In the New Testament account of the 40 days, the story of Thomas may be the most memorable and inspiring of all Jesus' appearances. In order to visualize this fourth appearance, Ray Downing must turn again to the ancient burial cloth known as the Shroud of Turin. But even if it is authentic, how can the shroud become a blueprint for visualizing these miraculous events? Downing spent years working to extract a perfect three-dimensional likeness of the face in the Shroud of Turin. Nothing like it had ever been done before.
I think this is the most difficult project I've ever worked on.
The image on the shroud is covered in dirt and stains from centuries of wear and tear. It is also drenched in blood. So much blood, it partially obscures the face Ray Downing is trying to find.
There's a slight bit of difference between the amount of red in the blood and the amount of red in the image. And what we did is we exaggerated that. We pumped more yellow into the image and more red into the blood, pulling them apart.
For Downing, a far bigger obstacle is the cloth itself. While it may look flat from a distance, up close, it has more ridges and valleys than the Egyptian desert. Downing needs to be able to tell the face from the cloth it's imprinted on.
Some information is repetitive. And if it repeats, you can find it. So since the weave of the fabric is repetitive, the computer turns it into numbers, looks for repeating numbers, and pulls them out. That's how we got the weave out of the Shroud of Turin image.
The result may be clearer, but it still doesn't look quite human. The problem? The shroud is not a flat canvas.
The first thing we did when we started trying to analyze what was going on with the shroud was to trace it onto a piece of cloth and then lay that tracing on top of a head and see what happened. By imitating those distortions, we could take the shroud image and put it back into that shape and figure out what the face looked like. It gave us a blueprint.
The blueprint can only take him so far. To finish the face requires the skill of an artist.
inevitably, you do get to a point where you run out of information. You cannot see the pores in a linen fabric. There's no eyebrows in the shroud. The hair is the same, and beard is the same color as the face. Why? The shroud doesn't have color. But it doesn't take a lot of guesswork to assign pores and skin textures to a model, to know that the man did have eyebrows, and to provide them. So at some point, you do have to leave the realm of actual information and use experience. The eyes blink, and you go, whoa, this is real.
A decade of research, science, and experience make possible the visualization of the fourth appearance of Jesus Christ. Exactly 8 days after the third appearance, the disciples remain in hiding in the upper room. This time, Thomas is there.
Thomas wasn't at the original meeting where Jesus appeared. He's probably afraid or discouraged or just didn't want to be there because somebody might show up to arrest them all.
Thomas came back. His colleagues told him that the Lord is risen. We've seen him. He was here. And he says, I refuse to believe that. That's absolutely ridiculous. He's dead. Deal with it.
Thomas said what a lot of us would have said. I don't believe it. Prove it. I got to see it for myself. Now that you're here, I need more evidence.
Thomas has an attitude different than everybody else. Thomas wants evidence. Thomas wants to know that this is man who carries the history in his flesh.
I think a lot of people like the story of Thomas because he seems modern, very skeptical, very rational, empirical. He says, I want to be able to feel and touch and put my fingers in the nail prints and stick my hand in the wound in the side, and Jesus shows up and shows him. And therefore, I actually think that's a pretty appealing story to modern people who have a lot of doubts.
Thomas is a scientist. He's doing exactly what a scientist would do. Show me. Demonstrate.
Using the image of Jesus from the Shroud of Turin, Downing will now try to depict the best-known moment in the story of the 40 days. The moment when a resurrected Jesus goes out of his way to convince doubting Thomas.
And he calls Thomas forward and says, Thomas, take your fingers and put them into my hand. Put your hand into my side. Thomas, don't doubt any longer.
Phenomenally, Jesus says, go for it. Have a look. Do that. Test me. Use science and satisfy yourself that this is real. That's an invitation. That's not just for Thomas. That's for us as well.
Even after Thomas saw Jesus, he wasn't convinced until he touched him. Thomas moves from being a doubter to being an evangelist, and that happened with all of the disciples.
Jesus says at that point, when it's clear that Thomas does believe, blessed are those who have believed without seeing.
Most of us in history, of course, didn't get to see Jesus that way. So we have to take it on the authority of other people. We have to weigh the evidence. We don't get to actually see him.
The appearances after the resurrection and before the ascension are anecdotes that show us how this movement moved from being a group of intimidated, terrified, defeated failures to becoming a group of people who were about to ignite the empire.
The miraculous experience of the 40 days will change these anxious disciples into fearless apostles. The key to their transformation will be an event so spectacular and mysterious that it has defied description for 2,000 years. The ascension of Jesus Christ. In the story of the 40 days between resurrection and ascension, Christ appears 6 times to his stunned followers. It is these few appearances that Ray Downing and his team have been attempting to bring to life.
We've got 4 appearances finished and behind us now, and what I see as good about it is we know that the real face of Jesus works, that it looks believable, that the geometry works, facial expression works, the body moves correctly.
It looks very authentic.
Exactly. So all those problems are behind us, but the contextual problem is different now. I mean, Jesus is by the side of a lake. Now the context is expanded.
Yeah.
Only 2 more appearances remain. The next will take place on the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus will perform one of the most surprising miracles in the Bible. But before Downing and his team can bring that scene to life, a persistent question must finally be answered. Why do today's Christians know so little about the story of the 40 days? The answer begins with the fate of the followers of Jesus Christ in the aftermath of the crucifixion. Life for most Christians becomes a hell on earth. Thousands are said to have been put to death merely for believing that Jesus Christ had returned from the dead.
The only religion that was suspect in the Roman Empire was the Christian movement. And that, of course, is because Jesus of Nazareth had been crucified as a rebel against the Roman Empire. Many of the leaders of this movement were officially hounded down and killed.
But then, in the year 312 AD, 3 centuries after the death of Jesus Christ, a momentous change occurs. The place is Italy, not far from the city of Rome. The night before a battle against an imperial rival, a Roman general named Constantine wakes from troubled sleep.
The night before the battle, he has a dream in which it is revealed to him that if he goes into the battle under the sign of the Christian cross, he will be victorious. Before the battle, in the sky, he has a vision of the cross in the sky, and the cross appears to him as a sword. And he instructs his soldiers to reconfigure their lances and their smaller blades into the sign of a cross. And they go into battle, and on the strength of that sign, he's victorious. And he wins the battle, he becomes the Roman emperor.
He had become a Christian, and Christ was his patron. Suddenly, the emperor himself was a Christian. That was an enormous surprise and transformation. It meant the persecution stopped, of course.
For the first time in its 300-year history, Christianity is becoming organized under the banner of the Roman Empire. And that empire determines how the story of the 40 days will be told.
Before Constantine, the Christian movement was defined by its diversity. Christian communities in Syria, in Palestine, in Egypt, in what's today Algeria, in Italy, Christian communities, each with their tradition, each with their texts, each with their emphasis on the meaning of Jesus. After Constantine, whose overwhelming political agenda is the unification of a vast empire, that diversity was problematic.
One group in particular has an organizational structure Constantine understands, and that serves his purposes.
So he chose the group that was called Catholic, that took its structure from the Roman Empire, the system of the diocese, and took its structure from the Roman army. So you have bishops, priests, and deacons. It's orderly, they communicate, one network.
In the year 325, Constantine summons his new bishops to the city of Nicaea, in what is now modern-day Turkey, where their version of the resurrection story is made official.
He has summoned them all, and he's given them the order. He wants them to come up with a creed, a statement of what the meaning of the Christian faith is, so that he can hold people to it, and therefore unify the empire under one clearly defined doctrine.
That means one official version of Christ's life, death, and ascension. All other stories are deemed unofficial and eventually weeded out.
with the power of the Roman state now saying to people, you believe, but you believe wrongly. You have to believe according to the creed, and if you don't believe according to the creed, you're dead.
Most believers today still recite the words that came out of that council 1700 years ago, words that include no mention of the 40 days.
The creed is a historical artifact. It's a snapshot of the way the Christian movement thought of itself at that time. It's become something much more since then, of course. Its imprecision and its incomprehensibility in some ways one of its advantages, because we are, after all, talking about something profoundly mysterious.
But while Christianity's official creed makes no mention of the 40 days, a handful of miraculous stories somehow survive in the Gospels of the New Testament. 6 key appearances. According to the book of John, a resurrected Jesus travels further away from the site of his crucifixion than ever, roughly 68 miles north to the Sea of Galilee.
In the Sea of Galilee appearance, we have the apostles getting a little back to normal, and they went fishing. And they were out in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, usual haunt, doing what they're fishermen, and they're doing what they do, and hopeless fishing.
They're fishermen. They're back to work. They're resuming their mundane lives.
In a sense, there was a safety in that, and there was a security in that. They could forget about the trauma of his death, forget about their disappointments that he didn't become a glorious king of Israel.
After all night of catching nothing, they see a man.
They look up in the mist of dawn, and they see a figure coming at them on the shore. Who is it?
They're near enough to the shore that they see this figure on the shore who says to them, you know, hey kids, you get anything? You catch anything? It's obvious they haven't caught anything, and he says, well, cast your net on this side of the boat. So they do this, and suddenly the nets are filled with fish. And how many fish are there? You know, dozens, scores? No, it actually gives us a number, 153. You get this time and time again in Scripture, these little quirky details that don't seem to make any sense except that they were actually true. Why would you put in a number like 153?
At that moment, Peter knows, oh my, this is he. This is Jesus.
Jesus is there with a fire. He's cooking some fish and some bread, and he says, bring some fish over.
Jesus on the shore of Galilee is back to his old haunts again. It's business as usual. They're fishermen once again, and Jesus is their friend once again.
What awaits them on shore is an almost unimaginable sight. Once again, using the latest technology and years of study into the appearances of Jesus Christ during the 40 days, Downing and his team seek to capture an astonishing moment.
Galilee is important because it's the place where the disciples lived and where they worked. And when Jesus appeared to them there, what he was saying was, my resurrection gives you meaning. It gives you a life that has meaning where you live, where your family is, where your roots are, where you work. We are not called to go and live off in some mountaintop. It's not an escapist kind of spirituality. The resurrection brings it home to where we physically live.
At the end of the project, I'd like to say that point of fact is we moved people back in time. That time wasn't a barrier. That Jesus 2,000 years ago and you of 2,000 years later met at one place, a place we built, walk away with a real sense that we saw an impossible event and contemplate the possibility that it was real.
With the appearance by the Sea of Galilee, the 40 days are drawing to a close. But Ray Downing and his team face one last enormous challenge: how to visualize what is arguably the most spectacular supernatural event recorded by history. A phenomenon known as the Ascension.
Christianity, as does Judaism, claims to be rooted in a real time and place. But when you get to something like the resurrection, the ascension, which are absolutely miraculous, otherworldly type of events that are rooted in historical time and place, we don't have words for those kinds of things. I mean, if you look at a genre, it would be science fiction.
But how can Downing depict an event so mysterious and profound that it has defied accurate description for 2,000 years? Is it possible to visualize what can barely be imagined? For Ray Downing and his team, the sixth and final appearance of Jesus Christ after resurrection is the most daunting of all.
So we've got 5 appearances finished and behind us now, and now it's the Ascension, which is supposed to be the climax of the 40 days.
How do we make it so that it just doesn't look kind of silly and kind of odd, like science fiction? How do we make it look believable and, you know, reverent and realistic?
I think changing the point of view is the key to it. So everybody's waiting to see Jesus float off the planet. So we'll stage it where there are the apostles, and the viewer starts to float off the planet. Change his point of view, because it's not silly when you do it. It's not silly when you see it. So let's let the viewer start the ascension and then focus on Jesus.
The ascension is the defining moment when those who had physical experience of Jesus no longer do. The story, in that sense, ends there. The story of Jesus' time on earth.
So what we have described is he ascended into the clouds. What we would have seen would have been, I think, beyond comprehension, beyond language, beyond words.
Indeed, the biblical accounts are vague and inconsistent, offering few clues to what really happened.
Scholars debate whether the ascension is meant to be taken literally or in some kind of figurative sense. But it appears that because Luke, the author of both the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, was so insistent on the bodily character of Jesus' death and resurrection, that he wants you to understand that the ascension was actually a bodily event, so that Jesus is actually physically going back to heaven.
The ascension, of course, is mysterious because we don't see people ascending to heaven very often. But what we do know is that Jesus, having appeared to many of his disciples, to many people, had to go.
I think it's really hard for us to imagine this. I think what we tend to do, our default mode with all of these stories, is to mythologize them and to turn them into some sort of, you know, cartoon event or something out of a movie. It's hard for us to look at them in a cold, calculated way and to think, this actually happened to human beings. This wasn't spooky and weird. It was somehow more real than we can imagine it.
Real enough to be recorded as history. And the authors of the 4 Gospels were not the only ones who spread word of these otherworldly events.
Many people said they saw him, and that conviction galvanized a movement, saying he's not dead, he's alive, he's coming back.
One of the books in the buried library discovered in the Egyptian desert in 1945 describes such an appearance.
The secret revelation of John begins as Jesus is dead. John, grieving, devastated, walks toward the temple to worship, and somebody comes up and taunts him and says, "You know that Messiah of yours, he was a fraud. He led you to destroy your own traditions as a Jew." And John is so devastated that he can't even go in and worship. He just wanders out to the desert by himself. Suddenly, he said he saw a blazing light and the earth shakes, and he hears a voice. The voice says, "John, John, why do you weep? I am the one who's with you always." And this is Jesus speaking.
But whatever the source, no story about the resurrected Jesus and the lost 40 days can compare to the final moment on earth, the Ascension. To computer graphic artist Ray Downing, the question is how to depict an event that even the men who claim to be witnesses cannot adequately describe.
The Ascension and depicting the Ascension is very, very complex. Jesus is having his apostles meet him at the Mount of Olives. And he's telling them that he's leaving. I mean, they've been through a life together, a death together, a rebirth together, and now he's leaving them on their own. And he's charging them with the responsibility of taking what he's given them and broadcasting it over the entire world.
Before he departs, the resurrected Jesus tells some of his followers what awaits them.
Jesus tells Peter how he's going to die, that it's going to be a violent death. Peter looks back and he sees John, the disciple that Jesus loved. And he wants to know, well, what's going to happen with this guy? And Peter is told by Jesus, that's none of your business. You know, his story is different from your story. You go do your story.
As a result of the 40 days, the apostles are changed men.
Prior to the resurrection and ascension, none of the disciples could have said that they spoke with credibility. None of them understood the story. None of them were passionate about the story enough to die for it. And by the time the resurrection and ascension happened, all of those disciples dedicated their lives completely to telling the world that Jesus Christ is raised.
They stuck to the story for decades and decades. Most of them died horrible deaths at the hands of the Romans. All they had to do was recant. Why didn't any of them recant? If you had experienced this, if you had actually lived through this and knew that Jesus actually rose from the dead, is there anything that could shut you up about it?
It's being lifted up to a cosmic level. I think we have to get off the ground and see the planet as an isolated thing that Jesus is getting away from.
Yeah. We could probably benefit from using a fractal generator, and that way we can increase the expanse of everything around him, and he's pulling off of the earth and going in.
Let's take a look at maybe not looking up at Jesus, but going with him.
Right.
But what do the apostles see on that 40th day when Jesus calls them to the Mount of Olives?
It's a mountaintop, the place we go to be close to God. The city on a hill itself, Jerusalem.
Going up gets you close to God, and Jesus literally goes up, because for these people, that is where God is, and Jesus then is literally there.
The resurrected Jesus, according to Matthew, met with his disciples, and he gave them instruction. He gave them further teaching, and he said, "You will be my witnesses in Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth," which is a way of saying, I'm going to build my church, and you're going to be the foundation.
They probably had a sense that his time was coming to an end. He had told them that he had to go back to his Father.
Part of them wanted to worship, and part of them wanted to reach out and pull him back and keep him there.
Jesus was raised up. He says, unless I am raised up, you cannot have the promise of eternal life. And so he's raised up on the cross. He's raised up from the dead. And then ultimately he's raised up in glory in the ascension, which is what we're depicting.
The scene was beyond human words. He was lifted up into heaven, and the Creed says he now sits on the right hand of God the Father. He's the head of the nations. He's the head of the universe. And so his reign now is everlasting and all-encompassing.
The ascension of the resurrected Jesus Christ to heaven completes the story of the lost 40 days.
The resurrection accounts are absolutely vital to understanding how the gospel writers are trying to portray Jesus. They feel, evidently, that they have to prove it to their readers, that Jesus was really physically raised from the dead. This wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't some kind of mirage people saw. It was an actual event.
But has this investigation revealed all that can be known about this mysterious time period? Does the trail end with the New Testament of the Bible, the Shroud of Turin, ancient manuscripts and hidden texts? Or do new discoveries await? Revelations from the Shroud, unknown gospels yet to be unearthed, new understandings of the teachings of Jesus?
The supernatural power of God has really come down into ordinary life, because the life seems so incredibly ordinary. That's just a way of saying God really is in our midst, God with us, Emmanuel.
He came to preach, to work miracles, to suffer, to die, to rise, and to appear again, and then to go and to be in heaven with his Father. And to promise to us that our mission here on this earth is really important, and that even though he's not with us today, we remember the time that he was.
This ascension means that Jesus has completely overcome those powers that appeared to overcome him.
He's resurrected from the dead. The crucifixion wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of the story. Remember when he came through the wall? Remember when he came to us off the shore of the Lake of Galilee? Remember when he walked among us? Are these stories true? Of course they're true. Are these stories history? Of course they're not history, the way we post-Enlightenment people, fact-obsessed, biology-obsessed people recount history. There's something better than that. They're gospel.